The dust was a living thing. It seeped through the cracks in the stagecoach walls. A fine red powder that coated Ilara's tongue, settled in the folds of her dress, and filmed over the cracked leather of the seat opposite her. It was the taste and smell of this new world, and it tasted of grit and endings. She pressed her fingers against the cool, smooth surface of the daguerreotype in her lap, the silver case worn smooth from 100,000 anxious touches. Inside was her mother's face, captured a decade ago, serene and smiling, a woman who had never known a landscape that was not green, a sky that was not softened by the haze of the Atlantic. "Hold on, ma'am," a gruff voice had said hours ago, the last human voice she'd heard. Now there was only the rhythmic creak of the leather straps, the jingle of the harness, and the steady, thudding beat of the horse's hooves against the baked earth, a symphony of desolation. Outside the window, the world was vast and terrifying. The Arizona Territory. Even the name felt sharp and dry on her tongue. It was nothing like the ordered, tree-lined streets of Boston, where buildings huddled together for comfort against the sea winds. Here, everything stood alone. Towering red rock formations, sculpted by a wind that never seemed to stop, rose from the flat earth like the bones of ancient giants. Sun-scorched plains stretched to a horizon that shimmered with a heat that warped the very air. And the sky was the most intimidating part of all. It was not the gentle, shifting blue of home. It was an endless, indifferent, hard-edged sapphire, a cosmic emptiness that offered no comfort, no shade, no mercy. It was a sky that had seen everything and cared for nothing. A wave of panic, cold and sharp despite the oppressive heat, washed over her. What am I doing here? The question had been her constant companion for 2,000 miles. Duty. A small, stern voice in her mind answered. Duty to her late father, who had died with his accounts in disarray, leaving her with a good name and little else. Duty to the memory of her mother, whose last wish had been for her daughter to be secure. And duty to her Uncle Thomas, her mother's brother, who had arranged this solution. Silas Kane, a man she knew only from a single, stiffly written letter and her uncle's glowing endorsements. A man of considerable means. The letter had read, in her uncle's spidery hand, "A rancher of great importance in the territory. He will provide for you. Ilara, your future will be secure." Security felt a long way off. It felt like a lie whispered in a drawing room a world away. Here, there was only the grit of the dust and the unsettling, profound silence of a wilderness that did not know her name and would not mourn her passing. She clutched the daguerreotype tighter. This was the price of escaping genteel poverty. This was the cost of security, a journey into the heart of nowhere to marry a stranger. The stagecoach lurched, throwing her against the hard wall. After what felt like an eternity, the rhythm of the hooves changed, slowing as they entered the outpost of redemption. Ilara peered through the dusty window. It was less a town and more a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings, huddled together as if for protection against the vastness that surrounded them. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge belching black smoke, and a dozen smaller, meaner-looking structures lined a single wide street of ankle-deep dust. Cowboys with sun-creased faces and guns strapped low on their hips stopped and stared as the stagecoach rolled to a halt, their eyes lingering on the window where her silhouette appeared. Women in drab calico dresses hurried past, their faces hidden by bonnets, casting suspicious, sideways glances. The air was thick with the smell of horse sweat, manure, and something else, a palpable sense of lawlessness, of hard lives lived on the very edge of civilization. The door was pulled open, and for a moment, the brutal, unfiltered sunlight blinded her. A man stood there, his shadow falling over her. "Miss Lowell?" he asked. His voice was deep but flat, without warmth. "I am," she managed, her own voice a reedy whisper. He reached in, not to offer a hand for assistance, but to take her arm in a grip that was less a courtesy and more an act of possession. As she stepped down into the dust, her black traveling boots instantly turning a dull red, She got her first proper look at Silas Kane. He was handsome, in a severe, rugged way. His face was all sharp angles, his jaw firm, his nose straight. But his eyes, set deep under a heavy brow, were the color of faded denim and just as cold. They assessed her from head to toe, a quick, dismissive inventory. He was not looking at his bride, he was inspecting livestock. "The journey was satisfactory, I trust," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement that closed the subject. "It was long," she said, trying to pull her arm from his grasp. His fingers only tightened. He gave a curt nod. "Your trunk will be collected. We'll leave at once." He led her to a wagon, not speaking another word. He did not ask if she was tired or thirsty. He did not smile. He treated her as if she were a parcel he had just signed for. His property now, to be transported as he saw fit. The journey to his ranch was even longer and more silent than the stagecoach ride had been. They traveled away from the small cluster of civilization that was Redemption, plunging deeper into the desolate beauty of the desert. Elara sat stiffly on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape slide by with a growing sense of dread. The cacti, tall and branching like monstrous candelabras, stood like silent, thorny sentinels guarding a kingdom of rock and sand. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. In the distance, the cry of a lone coyote echoed across the plains, a high, mournful sound that did not seem like a call to a mate, but a lament for the dying of the light. The ranch house, when they finally reached it, was a shock. It was a large, 2-story wooden structure, grand and imposing against the darkening landscape. It was a house that belonged in the Ohio Valley, not in the middle of the Arizona desert. Inside, the surprise continued. The rooms were filled with heavy, dark wood furniture, velvet curtains, and gilded mirrors, all clearly shipped at great expense from the East. But for all its expense, it was a cold, soulless place. There was no warmth, no sign of a life lived within its walls. It was a monument to Silas Kane's wealth, a declaration of his power over this wild land. But it was not a home. A small, stooped woman with dark, braided hair and a worn face appeared from a doorway. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor. "This is Maria," Silas said, gesturing dismissively. "She will see to your needs." Elara looked at the housekeeper and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. There was a faint, yellowing bruise high on Maria's cheekbone, and her eyes, when they briefly flickered up to meet Elara's, were filled with a deep, bottomless fear. It was a silent, terrifying warning. Silas led Elara up a grand staircase to her room. It was spacious, with a 4-poster bed and a wardrobe that would not have been out of place in a Boston mansion. "This will be your room," he stated. "You will find everything you need. We will be married tomorrow at noon. The justice of the peace will come from town." His language was purely transactional, as if he were outlining the terms of a business deal. He saw her as another acquisition, a fine piece of Eastern furniture to complete his collection. He walked to the window and stared out into the blackness. "This is all mine," he said, his voice low and hard. "Every rock, every snake, every blade of grass as far as you can see. I took this land from the sand and the savages, fought for it, bled for it. They didn't know what to do with it. They wandered over it like ghosts. A man has to tame this country, bend it to his will. That's the only law out here." His words, meant to impress her with his strength and power, only filled her with a profound unease that was quickly solidifying into genuine fear. The way he said the word savages, spitting it out like something foul, revealed a deep-seated cruelty. She looked past his broad shoulders, out the window and into the impenetrable darkness of the desert night. She felt 1,000,000 miles from everything she had ever known, a tiny, flickering candle in a vast and lightless room, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The wedding day dawned gray and oppressive. A thick blanket of cloud had moved in, muting the harsh colors of the desert and trapping the heat against the earth. The air was heavy, still, and charged with an unspoken tension. The ceremony was a small, grim affair held in the ranch's dark, wood-paneled parlor. A handful of Silas's ranch hands, big, brutish men who smelled of leather and sweat, stood awkwardly along one wall, their spurs scratching against the polished floor. The justice of the peace, a nervous little man with sweat beading on his upper lip, and the sheriff from Redemption, a man with wary eyes, served as the only other witnesses. Ilara stood beside Silas, feeling like a ghost, a prop in a play she had no role in writing. The white dress she wore, a simple gown of muslin and lace she had sewn herself, felt stark and out of place in the gloom of the room, a beacon of innocence in a place that had none. Silas was impatient. His movements were sharp, proprietary. He held her arm in his unyielding grip, his fingers digging into her skin, as the justice of the peace mumbled through the terse, legalistic words of the ceremony. A storm, which had been a mere suggestion on the horizon, began to gather in earnest. The sky outside the large parlor window darkened to a bruised purple gray. The wind, which had been still all morning, began to pick up. At first a low moan through the eaves, then a sharp rattle at the window panes. The rising storm was a perfect mirror of the tempest in Ilara's soul, a primal, desperate urge to flee, to run from this room and this man and this life, seized her. But his hand was on her arm, a manacle of flesh and bone. She was trapped. The wedding night was a nightmare from which she thought she would never wake. After the witnesses had departed, Silas began to drink heavily, pouring whiskey into a glass with a steady, determined hand. He sat in a large leather chair, watching her, his cold eyes taking on a predatory gleam. The storm outside had grown in fury, the wind howling like a tortured animal, and sand began to hiss against the glass of the windows. "You're my wife now," he said, his voice slurred but losing none of its hard edge. "You'll learn your place here. You'll learn what I expect." He rose and came towards her. The smell of whiskey was a foul cloud around him. He reached for her, and his touch was not that of a husband, but of a master claiming a possession. His attempt to force himself upon her was brutal, clumsy, and filled with a cold, loveless rage. Terror, pure and undiluted, gave Ilara a strength she did not know she possessed. She was no longer a frightened girl from Boston. She was a cornered animal fighting for its life. She fought back, scratching at his face, twisting in his grasp, her hand, flailing wildly, connected with a heavy ceramic water pitcher on a nearby washstand. With a strangled cry, she seized it and brought it down with all her might against the side of his head. The pitcher shattered, and Silas staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, followed by a wave of pure, murderous rage. He was stunned, momentarily off balance. In that single, chaotic moment, Ilara saw her chance. It was her only chance. The storm outside had broken with terrifying fury. It was a full-blown sandstorm, a brown, churning maelstrom that had turned the world outside the window into a screaming, opaque chaos. Using the storm as her cover, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would break, she fled, clad only in her fine wedding dress, now torn at the shoulder. She wrenched open the heavy front door and ran blindly out into the screaming wind and stinging, blinding sand. The lights of the ranch house, her gilded cage, were swallowed by the swirling darkness in an instant. She had no destination, no plan, no hope. There was only the desperate, animalistic need to escape. The desert, the vast and terrifying wilderness she had so feared, was now her only sanctuary. She stumbled through the storm for what felt like an eternity, a lifetime of terror compressed into minutes. The sand was a physical assault. It scoured her skin, filled her lungs, and blinded her. The wind tore at her, a malevolent force intent on ripping her from the earth. The beautiful, terrifying landscape she had observed from the safety of the stagecoach was now an active, hostile enemy trying to kill her. Her fine muslin dress was shredded by the grasping thorns of unseen bushes. Her soft leather shoes were no match for the rocky ground, and soon her feet were cut and bleeding, leaving a trail she could not see. She was completely disoriented, with no sense of direction, no landmark visible in the brown chaos. Dehydration seized her, her throat raw and parched. Exhaustion was a leaden weight, dragging at her limbs. As the desert night fell, a profound chill began to set in, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the memory of the day's heat. Her body began to shake uncontrollably. She was succumbing to the elements, her strength failing, her will to run dissolving into a numb despair. She collapsed at the base of a large rock outcropping, the rough stone offering the only shelter she could find. She curled into a ball, the tattered remains of her wedding dress a pathetic shield against the raging storm. Her consciousness began to fade, the world dissolving into a roaring, brown nothingness. Her last coherent thought was that she was about to die, here, alone, in this God-forsaken land. The sound of the wind was her only funeral dirge. As dawn approached, the fury of the storm began to subside. The wind quieted its scream to a mournful whisper, and the thick, churning sand began to settle back to the earth. In the canyons a few miles away, a man named Haske moved with the quiet, economical grace of someone who was as much a part of the landscape as the rocks and the scrub cedars. He lived alone in an isolated hogan, a self-imposed exile from his people, a man of quiet observation whose life was attuned to the ancient rhythms of the land. He was checking his traps, his eyes scanning the damp sand for the familiar tracks of coyote and rabbit. He was tracking a coyote, its prints clear and sharp, when he saw something else. Overlaid on the coyote's tracks were strange, faint footprints, nearly erased by the storm. They were small, unshod, and heading nowhere sensible. His curiosity, a rare indulgence, was piqued. He abandoned the coyote's trail and followed the strange new one. The tracks led him to a cluster of red rocks, and there, curled at the base of the outcropping, he saw her. His first thought was that she was a ghost, a spirit brought by the storm, a chindi. She was a pale, broken shape against the red earth, her white dress so caked in mud and streaked with blood that she was barely distinguishable from her surroundings. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. As he drew closer, he saw the faint, fluttering pulse in her neck. She was alive. He stopped, his face a mask of stone, a white woman. Here, in this state, a deep, instinctual wariness settled over him. A white woman meant trouble. It meant riders with guns and questions he did not want to answer. It meant the brutal, encroaching world he had deliberately left behind. His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 30 years, was to turn and walk away, to leave her for the sun and the vultures, to avoid the inevitable danger she represented. But he did not move. Something in her utter vulnerability, in the stubborn, unconscious fight for life that made her chest rise and fall in shallow breaths, stayed his hand. He knelt and saw the fresh, ugly bruises on her face and arms, the angry scratches, the terror that was etched onto her features even in sleep. He saw the torn remnants of a fine dress. This was not a woman who had simply gotten lost. This was a woman who had been running from something terrible. Against all his better judgment, against every instinct for self-preservation, he made a decision. He carefully, gently, slipped his arms beneath her. He was surprised by her lightness, her fragility a stark and shocking contrast to his own hard strength. He lifted her into his arms. She gave a soft, unconscious moan but did not wake. He stood, holding the unwanted, dangerous complication that fate had thrown in his path. The rising sun broke over the canyon rim, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land as he turned and began the slow, deliberate walk back toward his home. The walk was a slow, deliberate rhythm of necessity. Haske carried the unconscious woman not with tenderness, but with a careful, burdensome sense of duty. The canyon that was his home was a winding scar in the earth, its high red walls providing secrecy and shelter. He moved along paths that were invisible to a stranger's eye, his moccasins making no sound on the rock and sand. His dwelling, his hogan, was built into the curve of the canyon wall, so discreetly that one could pass by a dozen times and never see it. It was a simple, traditional structure of earth and timber, its rounded shape echoing the hills and the horizon. It was a place of solitude, a place of peace, and he had just brought a war to its doorstep. He pushed aside the heavy blanket that served as a door and stepped into the cool, dim interior. The air inside was thick with the clean, sharp scent of cedar smoke, the dry, herbal smell of medicinal plants, and the rich aroma of worked leather. It was sparse but meticulously orderly. In the center, a shallow fire pit held the gray ashes of last night's fire. A loom stood against one wall, a blanket half finished upon it, its geometric pattern speaking of clouds and mountains. On a flat stone near the fire, tools for silversmithing, hammers, files, and stamps were laid out with a jeweler's precision. Bunches of dried herbs and roots hung from the timbered ceiling. This was not merely a shelter, it was a workshop, a sanctuary, a life. This was the quiet purpose he had built from the ashes of another. He laid Alara on a thick pile of soft sheepskins near the fire pit. In the filtered light from the smoke hole above, her pallor was alarming. He assessed her condition with a practiced, dispassionate eye. The signs were clear: dehydration, exposure, exhaustion. Her skin was a roadmap of the storm's fury, covered in 100 tiny cuts and scrapes. The bruises on her face and arms were dark and ugly, the marks of a human violence that had preceded the violence of the desert. His actions were efficient, detached, yet possessed of an ingrained gentleness. He fetched water from an olla in the corner, moistening a strip of clean cloth to wipe the layers of grime from her face. He ground herbs into a paste, a poultice his grandmother had taught him to make, and carefully applied it to the deepest of her cuts. The work was familiar, but the subject was alien. He had tended to animals, to himself, but never to a white woman. Each touch was a risk, a crossing of a line he had drawn around his life years ago. He lifted her head and forced sips of water between her cracked, swollen lips. She swallowed weakly, a flicker of life in the deep well of her unconsciousness. As he worked, his mind was a turmoil of conflict. Silas Kane was a name spoken with fear even by the white men in the town. He was a powerful, ruthless man who held the land in an iron grip and considered the dying, the people, to be less than human, pests to be cleared from the land he claimed. To harbor Kane's runaway wife was not just a risk, it was a death sentence. And yet, to have left her to the desert would have been its own kind of death, a death of the soul. Alara drifted in a gray, formless sea of pain and confusion for what felt like an eternity. For a full day and night, she hovered in the space between life and death, her sleep plagued by feverish, disjointed nightmares. She saw Silas's face, his features distorted with rage, his cold eyes burning. She felt the sting of the sand, heard the roaring of the storm, a sound that seemed to come from inside her own head. She was falling, endlessly, into a suffocating brown darkness. When she finally surfaced, it was with a gasp. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to make sense of the strange, dim light. Her body ached with a profound, bone-deep weariness. She was lying on something soft, a fire burning low a few feet away, its smoke rising in a lazy column toward a hole in the ceiling. The air smelled of wood smoke and unfamiliar herbs. She was inside, sheltered. But where? Then she saw him. He was sitting on the other side of the fire, perfectly still, his dark, unreadable eyes watching her. He was a silhouette against the light of the doorway, his features obscured. But she could see the hard line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders, the long black hair that fell past them. Her mind, foggy with fever and fear, leaped to a single, terrifying conclusion. A stranger, a man, an Indian. And it was a conditioned response, a terror born of 1,000 whispered stories and prejudiced warnings from her Boston upbringing. The savage in the wilderness. Her heart seized in her chest. A choked sob escaped her lips, and she tried to scramble away, to put distance between them. But her body was a leaden weight, weak and screaming in protest. Her limbs refused to obey, and she could only manage a pathetic, crab-like shuffle on the soft sheepskins, the movement sending waves of agony through her battered muscles. The man across the fire did not move. He simply watched her terrified struggle. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the harsh guttural sound she might have expected. It was a low, quiet rumble, his English deliberate and laced with the accent of one who spoke it as a second language. "You are safe," he said. "The storm has passed." His words did not comfort her. They only confirmed her captivity. She stared at him, wide-eyed, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "You cannot stay here," he continued, his voice even and calm. "You have brought danger to my home." He paused, letting the words sink in. "When you are strong enough to travel, I will take you to the mission at San Rafael. It is many miles, but you will be safe there." Panic, cold and absolute, gripped Ilara. The mission. That meant leaving this shelter, this strange, temporary safety. It meant being cast back out into the wilderness where Silas and his men were surely searching for her. She had a sudden, vivid vision of being caught, of Silas's triumphant, enraged face as he dragged her back to the ranch, or worse, of being left alone again in the desert, this time to die of thirst under the indifferent blue sky. The thought was more terrifying than the man sitting in front of her. The dam of her control, already cracked and weakened, broke completely. A raw, desperate sob tore from her throat, and tears, hot and thick, began to stream down her face, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She looked at him, her entire being focused into a single, desperate plea. "No," she whispered, the word ragged and broken. "Please, do not send me away." She pushed herself up onto one elbow, the effort making her head swim. "If I leave now, I'll die out there." Out. The words hung in the quiet space between them, stripped of all pretense, all artifice. It was not a plea from a white woman to a Navajo man. It was the raw, unfiltered cry of a soul at the very end of its rope, a terror so genuine it transcended the vast cultural gulf that separated them. The sound of it, the sight of her unfiltered despair, cut through the carefully constructed emotional walls Hask had built around himself for years. For the first time, he saw not an outsider, not a symbol of the world that had brought his own so much pain, but a fellow creature, cornered and suffering. He saw the truth of her words in her eyes. His own eyes, which had been hard and distant as stone, softened with a flicker of something he had not felt in a long, long time. It was a reluctant, unwelcome stirring of empathy, of compassion. It was a feeling that went against all logic, against every instinct for self-preservation. He had every reason to refuse, every reason to save himself, but he could not. He held her gaze for a long moment, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and her own choked sobs. Then, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent contract, a concession that sealed both their fates in that small, smoky room. He would not send her away. Not yet. The days that followed were filled with a tense, watchful silence. Ilara's body recovered slowly, the deep aches receding, the cuts beginning to heal. Her strength returned in small, grudging increments. Haske went about his daily routines with a quiet, deliberate focus that seemed to exclude her entirely. He rose with the sun, disappearing into the canyons to hunt or check his traps. He tended to a small, hidden patch of corn and squash that grew near a seep in the canyon wall. He spent the afternoons working on his silver jewelry, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his small hammer a constant, metronomic sound in the quiet of the hogan. He was a ghost in his own home. He provided her with food, a bowl of cornmeal mush, a piece of roasted rabbit, and fresh water, leaving it on a flat stone near her sleeping pallet without a word. He kept his distance, moving around her as if she were a piece of furniture, a dangerous object he was careful not to disturb. Ilara watched him from her bed of sheepskins. Her initial, heart-pounding fear slowly began to be replaced by a cautious curiosity. She observed the grace and efficiency of his every movement. He did not walk upon the land. He was a part of it. He moved with a silence and purpose that made her own clumsy. City-bred movements feel loud and foolish. She watched his hands as he worked the silver, his long, strong fingers surprisingly nimble and precise as they stamped intricate patterns into the metal. She saw the beauty of the things he made, heavy bracelets with designs like storm clouds, delicate necklaces that echoed the shape of a dragonfly's wing, earrings like the crescent moon. There were stories in the silver, she realized, though she did not know the language to read them. One afternoon, he returned from a hunt and laid a bundle on the floor beside her. He unrolled it without a word. It was a simple tunic, sewn from soft, supple buckskin, with a plain fringe at the hem and sleeves. He had also left a pair of moccasins. He turned and left the hogan, giving her privacy. The gesture was purely practical. Her wedding dress was a tattered, blood-stained ruin, unfit for anything. But as she struggled out of the remnants of her old life and slipped the soft, earthy-smelling tunic over her head, the act felt strangely intimate, deeply symbolic. She was shedding the last vestiges of Alara Lowell of Boston, the bride of Silas Kane. She was becoming someone else, someone new and undefined. The fragile, silent peace of their cohabitation was shattered a week after her arrival. Haske was outside, grinding corn, when he suddenly went still, his head cocked, listening. Alara, sitting in the doorway to catch the morning sun, heard nothing but the buzz of insects and the whisper of the wind. Haske's hearing was attuned to a different world. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. "Inside," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now." He followed her into the hogan and pointed to a dark recess at the back, hidden behind a stack of sheepskins. "There is a cave. Go inside. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." Just as she scrambled into the small, dark opening, the sound reached her ears, the unnatural, jarring sound of many horses, their hooves shod with iron, clattering on the canyon rock. Haske moved the sheepskins back into place, plunging her into near-total darkness. From her hiding place, she could hear the riders entering the canyon. Their voices were loud, arrogant, echoing off the rock walls. It was Silas. His voice, full of rage and impatience, was a sound she would never forget. He and his men were shouting vile names for the natives, their words treating the sacred, silent land with a casual, brutal contempt. A gunshot cracked through the air, followed by a whoop of cruel laughter. She heard them dismount outside the hogan, through a tiny crack between the sheepskins. She could see Haske. He stood in front of his home, as still and unmoving as the ancient rocks around him, his face a mask of carved stone. "You!" Silas's voice boomed. He did not use a name. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me. A woman. White woman. You seen her?" His words dripped with condescension, with the casual threat of a man used to getting what he wanted. Haske's reply was calm and even. "I have seen no one." "Don't lie to me," Silas snarled. "She ran off into the storm a week ago, headed this way. A woman like that wouldn't last a day out here alone. Someone took her in." "The storm erases many tracks," Haske said, his gaze steady, unwavering. The tension was a physical thing, a tightening in Alara's chest. She held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was certain they would be discovered, that Silas would tear the hogan apart. Silas stared at Haske for a long, silent moment, his cold eyes searching for any flicker of deceit. He clearly suspected him, but he had no proof, and there was something in Haske's unyielding stillness that he could not seem to penetrate. "If I find out you're lying," Silas said, his voice a low, menacing promise, "I'll come back and burn this mud hut to the ground with you in it. We'll be back. We'll be searching every one of these canyons." After another tense moment, Silas turned and mounted his horse. Alara listened as the sound of the horses faded, leaving behind a ringing, terrified silence. The immediate threat had passed, but the reality of their situation had crashed down upon them with the force of a physical blow. They were not safe. Her presence here was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. That evening, The shared danger forged a small, tentative crack in the wall of silence between them. Haski roasted a rabbit he had snared, and for the first time, he motioned for her to join him by the fire. He divided the meat, giving her a generous portion on a piece of flat bark. They ate together, not as captor and captive, or as reluctant host and unwanted guest, but as two people sharing a fire against an encroaching darkness. The silence was different now. It was not empty, but filled with the unspoken memory of the afternoon's terror. Ilara, finding her voice for the first time in days, spoke quietly. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little hoarse from disuse, "for saving my life, and for today. You protected me." He looked at her, his dark eyes shadowed in the firelight. He gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. "What is your name?" she asked softly. "Hask," he replied. He paused, then looked at her. "And yours?" "Ilara." The exchange was simple, almost trivial, but it was a profound shift. They were no longer a white woman and an Indian. They were Haske and Ilara, individuals. He began to speak then, in his sparse, careful English. He pointed with his chin toward the smoke hole in the ceiling, through which a patch of deep indigo sky was visible, glittering with stars. He began to name the constellations, first in his own tongue, the words soft and liquid, and then in English. He told her the stories behind them, the stories of his people. He told her about the land, pointing out into the darkness. He spoke of the plants she had thought were just weeds, explaining their uses, one for healing wounds, another for easing fever, a third whose roots held water. Ilara listened, captivated, her fear of him slowly, almost imperceptibly, melting away. She began to see the desert not as the barren, hostile wasteland of her imagination, but as a place of hidden life and harsh, demanding beauty, a place with its own stories, its own laws, its own soul. For the first time, she was seeing the world through his eyes. A few days later, her strength almost fully returned. Ilara gathered the courage to ask him about his silversmithing. She had watched him for hours, mesmerized by the process, by the way he transformed dull lumps of metal into objects of intricate, breathtaking beauty. He was working on a bracelet, hammering a fine line of silver into a gentle curve. He was hesitant at first, his movements faltering for a moment. His craft was deeply personal, a part of himself he did not share. But then he stopped his hammering and picked up the piece he was working on. The pattern he was stamping into it was like fine lines of falling rain. "I learned from a Mexican platero," he said, his voice low. "When I was a young man, I traveled south with my uncle. My people, they did not approve. Silver is not our way. Turquoise, shell, stone, those are of the earth. Silver is from the white man's money." He explained that this act, this desire to learn a foreign craft, had created a rift between him and the more traditional members of his tribe. He told her that each piece he made told a story. He picked up another piece, a heavy pendant. "This is a prayer for rain," he said, tracing the cloud-like patterns with his finger. He held up a delicate ring. "This is the memory of a journey my father took to the salt flats." He was revealing a glimpse of his own past, of a life caught between two worlds, not fully belonging to either. He was not just a hunter, not just a man of the desert. He was an artist, a man with a deep well of sensitivity and pain hidden beneath his stoic exterior. He was an outcast by choice, a man who had forged his own path, a path of solitary creation. Ilara reached out, her fingers hesitating for a moment before she gently touched the cool, smooth surface of the bracelet he held. She could feel the weight of it, the solid reality of the metal, and in it, she felt the weight of his story. In that moment, looking at the intricate designs that had come from his hands, from his heart, she saw him clearly for the first time. She saw not a savage, not a frightening stranger, but a man of profound depth and complexity, a man with a soul as intricate and as beautiful as the patterns he created. A quiet, unfamiliar feeling began to take root in her heart. It was a feeling of awe, of respect, of a deep and burgeoning admiration. The days bled one into the next, measured not by the hands of a clock but by the slow, deliberate crawl of shadows across the canyon floor. Weeks turned into a month. The raw wounds on Ilara's body healed, fading into pale, silvery scars. But the more profound healing was happening within her, under the vast, quiet dome of the desert sky. Her spirit, so bruised and battered, was slowly uncurling itself from the tight, fearful knot it had become. Haska began to teach her the ways of the desert, not with formal lessons or stern instruction, but through the quiet rhythm of shared experience. He never said, "Today I will show you how to find water." He would simply take an empty gourd and walk, and she would follow, watching as he read the subtle signs in the landscape: a line of cottonwood trees, a dip in the terrain, the flight of a particular bird that led them to a hidden, life-giving seep of water bubbling up from the rock. He did not lecture her on edible plants. He would pause on their walks, dig up a root with his knife, and offer her a piece, its earthy, slightly sweet taste a revelation. She learned to read the story written in the sand, the delicate, bird-like tracks of a quail, the heavy, deliberate paw print of a mountain lion, the looping, drunken trail of a snake. She learned to move as he did, quietly, placing her feet with care, making herself small and unobtrusive in the vast landscape. She learned to listen, truly listen, to the whisper of the wind as it moved through the pinyon pines, to the rustle of a lizard in the dry leaves, to the great, profound silence that was not an emptiness, but a presence in itself. This was more than just training in survival. It was a re-education of her entire being. The delicate Bostonian lady, who once would have fainted at the sight of a mouse, now learned to set a snare and feel a grim satisfaction at its success. She learned to clean a fish with Haska's sharp knife, her hands steady, her stomach no longer turning at the sight of blood and entrails. The landscape that had once terrified her with its alien indifference became a source of sustenance, a provider, and in its harsh, uncompromising beauty, a strange and profound comfort. Her hands, once soft and pale, objects of genteel uselessness, became tanned by the sun and calloused from grinding corn and gathering firewood. A fine web of lines appeared at the corners of her eyes from squinting into the brilliant light. She was being remade by the desert, her old self sloughing away like a dry, shed skin, revealing someone tougher, quieter, and more resilient underneath. As the physical distance between them shrank in the confines of their shared life, the strict emotional boundaries they had maintained began to blur. The days settled into a comfortable, unspoken rhythm of shared chores. They moved around each other with an intuitive grace, each knowing their role without the need for words. The silence between them was no longer tense and watchful, but companionable, a shared space rather than an empty one. One evening, as the canyon outside filled with the cool, purple shadows of dusk, Ilara was mending a tear in his buckskin shirt. The firelight flickered, and she leaned closer to see the stitch. Haska reached across the fire to add a piece of wood, and as he drew his hand back, the back of his knuckles brushed against her fingers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it was like a spark from a flint. A jolt of pure, unadulterated awareness shot through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She looked up, startled, and found his eyes on her. He looked equally taken aback, his hand frozen in midair for a heartbeat. The air between them grew thick, charged with a sudden, palpable energy. Neither of them spoke. She quickly looked back down at her sewing, her heart hammering in her chest, and he turned his attention to the fire. But the quiet intimacy of the room had been irrevocably broken, replaced by a new, thrilling, and dangerous current. Another time, he returned from a hunt to find her sitting outside the hogan, sketching on a flat piece of sandstone with a shard of charcoal from the fire. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear his silent approach. He stopped a few feet behind her, watching. She was drawing the canyon wall opposite them, capturing the deep cracks and the subtle shifts in color with a surprising skill and sensitivity. She was not just recording its shape, she was capturing its spirit. He saw his home, the place of his solitude, through her eyes, and saw a beauty he had long since taken for granted. A rare, small smile touched the corners of his lips. He had seen her as a victim, a burden, a danger. Now, he was seeing her as something more. He began to share more of himself, not in long speeches, but in small, quiet gestures. One morning she awoke to find a single, striking wildflower, a desert marigold of the most brilliant yellow, lying on the rock beside her sleeping pallet. It was a splash of impossible color in their muted, earthy world, a thing of delicate beauty that could only have been found with effort and thought. Another week. He spent 2 evenings working on a small piece of silver. He presented it to her without ceremony, simply placing it in her hand. It was a pendant, a simple, elegant spiral stamped into a disc of polished silver. He told her it represented the journey of life, the path that winds ever inward to the center of one's being. She threaded it onto a leather cord and wore it always, the cool metal a constant, secret weight against her skin. These moments of unspoken tenderness were glimmers of light in the shadows, but they were fraught with the weight of the forbidden. They came from 2 different worlds, separated by a chasm of culture, race, and history. Any connection between them was a dangerous transgression, a quiet rebellion against the brutal laws of their time. The source of Haska's profound, solitary sadness was revealed one night, born from the mournful cry of a coyote. It was a sound they heard every night, but on this particular evening, the animal's howl seemed to carry an extra measure of loneliness, a long, drawn-out note of grief that echoed endlessly off the canyon walls. Haska, who had been cleaning a rifle by the fire, went utterly still. The easy companionship that had grown between them vanished, and he became withdrawn, his face closing down into the hard, impenetrable mask she had first seen. Later, as they sat in silence, the weight of his sorrow was a tangible thing in the small hogan. Sensing his pain, Elara spoke softly, her voice gentle so as not to break the fragile quiet. "That sound," she said, "it makes you sad." He did not answer for a long time, simply staring into the dancing flames. She thought he would not speak, that he had retreated back into the fortress of his solitude. But then, in a low, rough voice, he began to tell her his story. It came out in pieces, a torrent of memory held back for years, finally breaking free. Years ago, he said, he had not been alone. He had a wife, Hina, and a young son, a boy named TSO. They had lived with their people. Then the fever came, a sickness brought by the white settlers, a disease for which their own medicine had no answer. The tribal medicine man chanted and prayed, but the fever only burned hotter in his son's small body. Hina grew weaker every day. Desperate, Hask had made a decision, against the wishes of the elders. Swallowing his pride, he rode to the nearby army fort to beg the white doctor for help. He had traded his silver for the white man's goods before. He thought a life could be bartered for as well. The doctor, a man with a hard face and tired eyes, had looked at him as if he were a stray dog. He had refused to come. He said he was there for the soldiers, not for Indians. Hask had pleaded, had offered all the silver he owned. The doctor had turned his back. By the time Haska returned to his family, his heart a cold stone of dread in his chest, it was too late. TSO was dead. His son's small body was limp and still. Hina, her spirit broken by her grief and her body ravaged by the fever, died 2 days later. The story was a raw, open wound, but the final blow was yet to come. His people, in their grief and fear, had blamed him. They said he had forsaken their traditions, that he had turned his back on their ways by seeking help from the white man. They said his association with the white world, his silver craft learned from a Mexican, had brought this curse, this ghost, upon his family. He was not formally banished, but he was shunned. He became an invisible man among his own people, his grief compounded by their judgment. He had chosen to leave, to build a life of penance and solitude here in this hidden canyon. His grief and their silent condemnation a heavy cloak he wore every single day. As he spoke, Elara wept. She wept silently, tears streaming down her face, her heart aching with a pain so profound it felt like her own. It was not pity she felt for him. It was a deep, shared sense of loss, an outrage at the terrible, grinding injustice of the world. She understood now the source of his stillness, the reason for the walls he had built around himself. They were walls of grief. When he finished, the silence that fell was heavy with his pain. Without thinking, moved by an instinct more powerful than thought, she reached across the small space between them and took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. His hand was rough and calloused, but it was warm. He flinched at her touch, but this time, he did not pull away. He let his fingers rest in hers, a silent acceptance of her comfort, a shared vulnerability that created an unbreakable bond between them in the flickering firelight. The emotional intimacy that had been building between them for weeks, brick by painful, tender brick, finally culminated in a physical expression. It happened on a hot afternoon, after a summer rain had softened the earth. A section of the hogan's outer wall had been damaged, and they worked together to replaster it with a mixture of mud and straw. The work was hard and messy. They passed the heavy, wet clay to each other, slapping it onto the wall and smoothing it with their hands. Soon, they were both covered in mud, from their hands to their faces. Alara, trying to wipe a stray piece of straw from her forehead, only succeeded in smearing a streak of brown clay across her cheek. Haske looked at her, and a real, genuine laugh escaped him, a low, rumbling sound she had never heard before. Seeing him laugh, his usual stern expression completely gone, made her laugh too. A bright, clear sound of pure, unadulterated joy. For a few minutes, they were not a reclusive Navajo and a runaway white woman. They were just a man and a woman, laughing together under the hot sun, their guards completely, blissfully down. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in fiery hues of orange and purple, they finished their work. They stood side by side, looking at the smooth, repaired wall, in the fading, magical light. Haske turned and looked at Alara. He was truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time, not as a burden, not as a danger, but as the strong, capable, beautiful woman she had become. He saw the resilience in her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, and the lingering warmth of her smile. He reached out, his movement slow and deliberate, and gently wiped the smudge of mud from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a tremor through her entire body. He did not pull his hand away. His thumb rested on her cheekbone, his touch lingering, his dark eyes searching hers. The air around them crackled with a powerful, unspoken desire. Alara's breath caught in her throat. All the laughter, all the shared work, all the unspoken moments had led to this. She leaned into his touch, a silent invitation, her eyes fluttering closed. He lowered his head, and their lips met. The kiss was tentative at first, a gentle, questioning touch. But then, as her hands came up to rest on his chest, it deepened, becoming a kiss of profound, desperate passion. It was a kiss of shared loneliness, of a powerful, burgeoning love that defied all reason. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection, a moment in which the world outside, with all its prejudice and all its danger, simply ceased to exist. For that brief, perfect moment. They were not their pasts or their presents, their races or their fears. They were simply a man and a woman, finding a desperate, beautiful solace in each other's arms. Their newfound intimacy, as fragile and beautiful as a desert wildflower, was immediately juxtaposed with a stark, brutal reminder of their reality. The next day, as Haske was on a ledge high above the canyon floor, checking a snare, he went still. He motioned for Alara, who was gathering herbs below, to be silent and to hide. She pressed herself into a crevice in the rock and followed his gaze. In the far distance, at the mouth of the canyon system, a lone rider was silhouetted against the sky. He was moving slowly, methodically, his head turning from side to side as he scouted the canyons. He was too far away to be identified, but they both knew who he worked for. It was a clear, unambiguous sign. Silas had not given up. The hunt was still on. The brief, beautiful moment of their kiss, the fragile sanctuary they had built, was instantly tainted by the cold, metallic taste of fear. They watched until the rider turned and disappeared from view. They were not safe. Their love, this thing they had just acknowledged, was not a shield. It was a liability. It did not make them stronger. It made them infinitely more vulnerable. Now, there were 2 lives to lose instead of 1. The rider's presence forced a conversation they could no longer avoid. That night, the mood in the hogan was somber, the easy intimacy of the day before replaced by a tense, grim reality. "He will not stop," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. "He will never stop." She looked at Hask, her eyes filled not with the old fear, but with a new, hard resolve. "I will not spend the rest of my life hiding in the shadows, waiting for him to find us." The woman who had run blindly into the storm was gone. In her place was a survivor, a woman filled with a new strength, a strength born from the love she felt for the man who sat across the fire. Haska looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and felt his own dormant spirit stir. For years, he had passively accepted his fate, living a life of quiet penance and lonely solitude. He had been surviving, but he had not been fighting. But now, looking at Alara, he knew he had something to protect, something to fight for. She had brought danger to his door, but she had also brought life. "We cannot run forever," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is my land. I will not be hunted on it." They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They had to confront Silas. The idea was terrifying. It was seemingly impossible. Silas had money, power, and a dozen men with guns. He had the law of the white world on his side. They had nothing but their wits, their intimate knowledge of the harsh land, and each other. Their love, born in desperation and nurtured in secret, had transformed. It was no longer just a source of comfort, a balm for their loneliness. It had become a catalyst for rebellion. They began to formulate a plan, their 2 minds working as one, their shared purpose solidifying their bond into a true and equal partnership. The tragic, inescapable irony was that the love that gave them the courage and the strength to fight was the very thing that had put them in the gravest danger of all. A strange and fragile peace settled over the hidden canyon, a period of watchful domesticity that existed in a state of constant, humming tension. Alara and Haska lived within a paradox. Their life together took on the simple, comforting rhythms of a husband and wife, yet the threat of discovery, of Silas Kane's relentless shadow, loomed over every sunrise and every shared meal, every unexpected sound. A rock falling from the canyon rim, the cry of a hawk was enough to make them both freeze, their eyes meeting in a silent question of shared fear. But in this fragile space, they fell deeper in love. Their bond, forged in terror and necessity, was now tempered and strengthened by the quiet routine of a shared daily existence. These were the moments of profound, quiet romance that fueled their resolve, that gave them something precious and real to fight for. Their love was not a thing of grand speeches or flowery declarations. It was a language spoken in 1,000 small, intimate gestures, in the spaces between words. They learned the habits of each other's bodies, the unique cadence of each other's presence. Alara learned the low, tuneless song Haske would hum, a sound deep in his chest, when he was completely absorbed in his silverwork, his hands moving with a fluid, mesmerizing grace. He, in turn, learned the way she would bite her lower lip when she was concentrating. Her brow furrowed as she pushed the heavy stone mano back and forth, grinding the day's corn into fine meal. He noticed the way the sunlight, slanting through the smoke hole in the late afternoon, would catch the red highlights in her brown hair. She noticed the way he always faced the mouth of the canyon when he sat, a silent, ceaseless sentinel. He began to teach her words in his language, the Din Bizad, the words for sun and moon and water and horse. The words felt strange and beautiful on her tongue, ancient and resonant, a secret code that bound them closer together. In return, she read to him from the one small book she had managed to save, a worn volume of poetry by a woman named Dickinson, which had been tucked into a pocket of her traveling bag. She had found it one day while cleaning her tattered belongings, a relic from another life. At night, by the soft, flickering light of the fire, her voice would be a quiet melody in the hogan, the strange, complex English verses filling the small, earthy space. He would sit and listen, his face unreadable in the shadows. But she knew he was hearing more than just the words. He was hearing the music of her soul, a soul he had helped to save. Their life was a tapestry of sensory moments, the sharp, clean scent of pinyon smoke that clung to their clothes and hair, the sweet, smoky taste of fire-roasted squash, a simple meal that felt like a feast, the rough, comforting feel of a single coarse wool blanket they shared on the cold desert nights, their bodies a silent source of warmth and solace for each other in the vast, dark wilderness. In these quiet moments, they were not a Navajo outcast and a white runaway. They were simply Alara and Hask, two souls who had found an unlikely home in each other. This period of quiet, stolen happiness was a stark, poignant contrast to the violence that had defined the beginning of their story, a fact that would make the inevitable return of that violence all the more tragic. The betrayal, when it came, began with something as simple and mundane as an empty flour sack. Their supplies had run low, the last of the cornmeal used up, the salt nearly gone. Hasky knew he had to make a trip to the nearest trading post, a remote, dusty establishment run by a grizzled, tobacco-chewing white man named Jedediah. Jedediah's post was a good day's ride away, and the man had a reputation for discretion, for asking no questions as long as a man's silver or pelts were good. It was a calculated risk, but a necessary one. Hask prepared for the journey with a grim sense of purpose. He carefully wrapped 3 of his finest silver bracelets, heavy cuffs with intricate designs of rain and sky, in a soft piece of buckskin. They were more than mere objects to him. They were his stories, his prayers, his art. Trading them for flour and salt felt like trading a piece of his soul. Ilara watched him, her heart tight with a nameless dread. She did not want him to go. She did not want to be left alone. "I will be back by tomorrow's sunset," he said, seeing the fear in her eyes. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare public gesture of affection. "Barricade the door, do not leave the hogan." The trading post was a low, dark building that smelled of dust, tanned hides, and cheap whiskey. A few other men were there, a trapper and a pair of prospectors, but Hask paid them no mind. He unrolled his silver on Jedediah's rough wooden counter. The trader's eyes, small and greedy, lit up at the sight of the masterfully worked metal. As they began to haggle, the door creaked open and 2 more men entered. Hask recognized them instantly. They were Silas Kane's men, their faces hard and sunburnt, their arrogance filling the small room. Hask remained perfectly still, his face a stoic mask, betraying nothing. The ranch hands swaggered to the counter to buy whiskey and ammunition. They spoke in loud, boastful voices, ensuring everyone in the post could hear them. They were spreading the word. Silas Kane had increased the bounty on his runaway wife. A handsome reward, they said, a fortune in gold coin, for any information on her whereabouts. They spoke of her with a crude, proprietary anger, as if she were a prize mare that had broken out of its corral. Haska kept his eyes down, his focus seemingly on the trade before him. He could feel Jedediah's gaze flicker from the silver on the counter to Hask's native face, and then to the loud-mouthed ranch hands. Avarice was a sickness, and Hask could see the fever of it taking hold in the trader's eyes. He finished his business quickly, trading the bracelets for flour, salt, coffee, and a few other necessities. He packed his goods onto his horse and left without a backward glance, the ranch hand's crude laughter following him out the door. He spurred his horse homeward, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He had not been gone for 10 minutes when Jedediah, the man of discretion, wiped his hands on his dirty apron, and called over a young boy who was sweeping the porch. He pressed a coin into the boy's hand and gave him quiet, urgent instructions, pointing him down the trail that led to the Kane Ranch. The glimmer of hope and domesticity Haska and Ilara had so carefully nurtured was about to be extinguished by the most casual and self-serving of betrayals. While Haska was away, Ilara was alone in the canyon for the first time. The silence was immense, unnerving. She barricaded the hogan door as he had instructed and tried to keep busy, but her mind was a whirlwind of anxiety. On the second day, the sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, turned a bruised, yellowish gray. The air grew still and heavy. Then, the rain began. It was not a gentle shower, but a sudden, violent deluge, a solid sheet of water that turned the dry canyon floor into a muddy, churning river in a matter of minutes. A low roar began to build, and Ilara knew instinctively what it was: a flash flood. She looked out and saw a wall of brown water, carrying with it rocks and uprooted bushes, surging down the main wash below the hogan. Their small, precious garden of corn and squash was directly in its path. The woman she had been months ago would have panicked, would have cowered in the hogan, helpless. But that woman was gone. Without a second thought, Ilara unbarred the door and ran out into the driving rain. Using a piece of scrap timber as a makeshift shovel, she worked frantically, digging a shallow trench to divert the worst of the rising water away from the fragile plants. The mud was thick and heavy. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but she worked with a desperate, focused energy. She saved the garden. She reinforced the earth around the base of the hogan, ensuring their home would not be undermined by the flood. When the rain finally stopped and the floodwaters began to recede, she stood, drenched and exhausted, covered in mud from head to toe, and looked at her work. She was no longer the helpless woman who had stumbled out of the storm. She was resourceful, capable, and as deeply connected to this land as the deep-rooted junipers that clung to the canyon walls. Haska returned at sunset to a canyon transformed by water. He saw the new, dark line of the flood, and his eyes immediately went to their garden. He saw the trench, the piled-up earth, the plants standing tall and safe. He saw Ilara, her face smudged with dirt, her clothes still damp, waiting for him in the doorway of the hogan. He looked from her to the evidence of her work, and his face, usually so controlled, broke into a look of profound, open admiration. He was filled with a deep, quiet sense of pride and a love so powerful it almost took his breath away. He dismounted and walked to her, taking the sacks of supplies from his horse, from his own belt. He untied a small, sheathed knife he had acquired at the post. It was a simple tool, its wooden handle worn smooth, its blade sharp and practical. He held it out to her. It was not a weapon he was giving her, but a tool. It was a symbol of her self-sufficiency, of her strength. It was a profound gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that she was no longer his ward, but his partner. She took it, their fingers brushing, her heart swelling with an emotion too deep for words. Their reunion, however, was tragically short-lived. The betrayal had been swift. Guided by the information from Jedediah, Silas Kane and a dozen of his men had ridden through the night. At dawn the next morning, as the first pale light of day was spilling into the canyon, the attack came. They did not ride in from the canyon mouth. They descended from the rim above, their figures appearing like dark, malevolent spirits against the brightening sky, their rifles glinting in the morning sun. The attack was brutal, overwhelming, and utterly without warning. The first sound was a rifle shot, the bullet splintering the wood of the hogan's doorframe, inches from Ilara's head. Haski reacted instantly, pulling her back from the doorway and grabbing his own rifle in a single, fluid motion. They were caught, trapped. Haska fought with a fierce, desperate courage, a courage born not of a desire for his own life, but for hers. He was a phantom in the rocks, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. He would fire from one position, then melt away into the shadows only to reappear in another, his shots precise and deadly. but he was hopelessly, impossibly outnumbered. Bullets whined and ricocheted off the rocks around them, chipping away at their sanctuary. Ilara, her heart pounding with terror, was no longer a passive victim. The knife Hask had given her was a solid, reassuring weight in her hand. She was a cornered animal defending her mate, her home. When one of the ranch hands tried to storm the hogan, she lunged from the doorway, the knife held low, her face a mask of furious determination. He recoiled, surprised by her ferocity, and in that moment, Hask's rifle cracked, and the man fell. But the fight could only have one end. In the chaos of the battle, as Haska was moving between two boulders, a bullet caught him in the leg. It was not a clean shot. The heavy slug shattered the bone, and he went down with a sharp, guttural cry of agony. The fight was over. In seconds. Silas and his men surrounded them, their guns all aimed at the wounded man on the ground and the defiant woman who stood over him, her small knife still clutched in her hand. The moment was one of utter, soul-crushing despair. Silas Kane stood over them, his handsome face a mask of triumphant rage. He looked at Ilara, at her buckskin tunic and her face smudged with dirt and powder, and his eyes filled with a venomous contempt. He saw her not as his wife, but as a sullied, defiant creature who had dared to defy him, who had chosen a native over him. "Tie her up!" he snarled at his men. Two of them grabbed Ilara, wresting the knife from her hand and binding her wrists tightly with a leather thong. As they dragged her away, Haska, bleeding profusely, his face pale and beaded with the sweat of his agony, pushed himself up on one elbow. "Wait," he gasped, his voice strained. Silas looked down at him, a cruel sneer on his face. "You got something to say before I kill you?" "The silver," Haska said, his words coming in ragged breaths. He was improvising, his mind racing, searching for a desperate gambit. "You want wealth? I can give it to you." He looked at Silas, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "I know of a place, a hidden vein of silver in the mountains, a place of legend among my people. More silver than you can imagine." It was a lie, of course. There was no such vein. It was a desperate, hopeless attempt to buy her time, to save her life at the cost of his own. Silas, for all his rage, was a man ruled by greed. The word silver caught his attention. His eyes narrowed. He hesitated, looking from the bleeding man on the ground to the defiant woman his men were holding. "You take me," Haska pleaded, his voice growing weaker. "I will lead you to it, in exchange, for her life. Let her go." A cruel, calculating smile spread across Silas's face. He had a better idea. "I'll take your deal," he said, "but with a twist. You'll be my guide, and she," he nodded at Ilara, "will be my insurance. We'll leave her here. When I have my silver, I'll come back for her. If you trick me, she'll pay the price before my men hunt you down." He pointed at one of his men, a particularly vicious-looking ranch hand named Cobb. "You'll stay, guard her. If she tries anything, you know what to do." Silas's men hoisted Haska's limp body from the ground, his shattered leg dangling uselessly. The pain was so immense that he nearly blacked out, but he forced himself to stay conscious. He had to see her one last time. His eyes met Ilara's across the small clearing. There were no words. There was no time. Their farewell was a single, silent, heartbreaking exchange of love, despair, and unimaginable terror. She saw in his eyes his love for her, and his apology for what was to come. He saw in hers a strength that broke his heart. They threw him onto a horse, tying him to the saddle. She watched them ride away, taking the man she loved to his certain death. The hope they had so carefully, so tenderly nurtured together was brutally ripped away, leaving only the cold, hard certainty of tragedy. Ilara was left alone, a prisoner in the home that had been her sanctuary, guarded by a cruel man, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces as she listened to the sound of Haska's horse, and her future fade into the vast, unforgiving silence of the canyon. The romantic idyll had been shattered, and the dark, tragic reality of their world had reasserted its control with a final, devastating force. The Hogan, once a sanctuary of warmth and quiet healing, had become a cage. Ilara was bound, her wrists and ankles tied with rough leather thongs, and left on the packed earth floor. The air, which had once smelled of cedar smoke and Hask's quiet presence, was now thick with the sour stench of stale whiskey and the oppressive presence of her guard, Cobb. He was a cruel, leering man with a slack mouth and dead eyes, a man who embodied the worst, most brutish aspects of Silas Kane's world. He sat on Haska's wood-chopping block, which he had dragged inside, taking swigs from a bottle and tormenting her with a casual, offhand cruelty that was somehow more terrifying than open rage. He told her, in graphic detail, what Silas would do to Hask once the lie about the silver was discovered. He spoke of what Silas would do to her when he returned, his words painting pictures of a future so bleak it made her soul shrink. Ilara's mind was a vortex of grief and terror. The image of Haski being dragged away, his pained, dark eyes locked on hers in that final, silent farewell, played over and over in her head. It was a wound that would never close, a memory burned into her very being. At first, there was only despair, a vast, hollow emptiness that threatened to consume her. She was a prisoner. The man she loved was being led to his death, and a fate worse than death awaited her. The tears that came were silent, burning tracks down her dusty cheeks. But as the hours wore on, as Cobb's taunts continued and the whiskey took further hold of him, something inside her began to shift. The despair did not vanish, but it began to cool, to harden, to crystallize into something else. It became a cold, focused, diamond-hard rage. She was no longer just a victim. A victim has something left to lose. She was a survivor who had already lost everything that mattered. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but the rage was stronger. It was a clean, pure fire that burned away the last of her helplessness. She stopped crying and began to think. She began to plan. She subtly, almost imperceptibly, tested her bonds, feeling for any give in the leather, any weakness in the knots. She watched Cobb, observing his habits. He was arrogant, complacent. He thought of her as a broken, helpless woman, an object. He did not see the fire behind her eyes. He did not see the predator that was awakening inside the prey. Her gaze roamed the familiar interior of the Hogan, but she saw it with new eyes. Every object was no longer a part of a home, but a potential weapon. The sharp-edged weaving tool lying near the loom, a loose stone in the floor near the hearth, the heavy, oblong stone pestle, the mano, that she used to grind corn. Her cage was also an arsenal, if only she could get free. Miles away, the journey was a slow-motion execution. Hask was tied to his horse, his shattered leg a source of blinding, relentless pain that pulsed in time with the horse's plodding gait. The world swam in and out of focus, a hazy blur of red rock and searing blue sky. He was barely conscious, clinging to the saddle horn to keep from pitching to the ground. But his mind, honed by years of solitude and observation, was brutally, terrifyingly sharp. His plan, born of desperation, was twofold. First, he had to lead them as far away from Ilara as possible, buying her time, any amount of time. Second, he had to find an opportunity, a single moment, to take Silas Kane down with him. It was no longer a plan for survival. It was a plan for vengeance. He deliberately chose the most difficult and dangerous paths, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain as his only weapon. He led them up narrow, winding trails that crumbled at the edges, across sun-baked mesas where the heat was a physical blow, and down into steep, treacherous canyons where a single misplaced hoof could send a horse and rider plunging to their deaths. He was systematically exhausting the men and their mounts, fraying their nerves, pushing them to the brink. Silas, consumed by a blinding, feverish greed for the mythical silver, was oblivious to the strategy. He saw the difficult terrain only as a testament to the secrecy and value of his prize. "Harder the trail, richer the reward," he shouted to his flagging men, his voice raw with impatience. He pushed them relentlessly, his cruelty a match for the cruelty of the landscape itself. The desert, the great indifferent wilderness, became Haska's silent ally. The sheer cliffs, the narrow, claustrophobic passes, the searing, relentless heat, they all conspired with him, wearing down his enemies, while he, a native of this harsh land, endured. With every grueling step, Hask's life force ebbed away, the fever from his wound rising, but his resolve only hardened. Back in the hogan, Cobb grew more complacent. The whiskey bottle was half empty, his movements sluggish, his eyes glassy. He had stopped his taunts, content now to sit and drink and stare at the fire. Alara, feigning a defeated, exhausted weakness, had slumped against the wall, her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow. She had lulled him into a complete, contemptuous sense of security. He saw her as no more of a threat than one of the sheepskins piled in the corner. Beneath the cover of her feigned despair, she was working. The small silver pendant Haski had made for her, the spiral of life, was tucked inside her tunic. Cobb, in his haste and arrogance, had missed it when he searched her. For hours, with painstaking, agonizing slowness, she had been using the sharpened edge of the silver disc to saw at the leather thong binding her wrists. The metal was soft, but the edge was just sharp enough. It was a slow, torturous process. The metal cut into her own skin, drawing blood, but she ignored the pain, focusing every ounce of her being on the single, repetitive motion. The pain was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. The moment came when Cobb, grunting, stood and turned his back to her to relieve himself in a corner of the hogan. In that instant, with a final, desperate pull, the last fibers of the leather gave way. Her hands were free. She did not hesitate. In a silent, fluid burst of adrenaline-fueled violence, she was on her feet. She seized the heavy stone mano from the hearth, its weight familiar and solid in her hands. The confrontation was not the clean, elegant violence of a storybook. It was clumsy, brutal, and terrifying. She brought the stone down on the back of his head with all her strength. He grunted and staggered, turning with a look of stunned surprise on his face. He was not a man easily felled. He lunged for her, and for a terrifying moment they struggled, a desperate, grunting battle for life. She was fueled by rage and grief, and she was stronger than he knew. She struck him again, and this time he went down, his body hitting the earth floor with a heavy thud. She stood over him, panting, her heart hammering. She had won. She quickly secured his own pistol and gun belt from his hip. She did not kill him. Killing him would make her no better than them. Instead, she used the same leather thongs that had bound her to tie him up, gagging him with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. Her escape was not one of relief or exultation. It was a moment of grim, cold determination. She took his horse, which was tethered outside, and his canteen of water, and without a backward glance at the man or the home she had shared with Hask, she rode. She was now armed, on horseback, and possessed of a single, all-consuming purpose, to find Hask. She harbored no sweet illusions about saving him. She knew, with a certainty that was a cold weight in her gut, that he was likely already dead or dying, but she could not let him die alone in the wilderness at the hands of those men. She had to get to him. It was a debt of love she had to pay. She rode out of the canyon, using the tracking skills Haska had so patiently taught her. The trail of a dozen riders was easy to follow. Her journey was a testament to her complete and final transformation. She navigated the brutal, unforgiving landscape with a skill and confidence that would have been unimaginable to the woman who had arrived from Boston months ago. She conserved the horse's energy, found water where no one else would think to look, and read the signs in the land as if it were a book she had known her whole life. She was driven by a love that had transcended hope and a burning need for justice, or, if not justice, then vengeance. The desert was no longer her enemy. It was the arena for her final, desperate act. Hask's journey, and his life, ended at a place he knew from his youth, a place his people called the Canyon of Echoes. It was a treacherous, high-walled box canyon with no exit but the way they had come in. It was a natural trap. It was here he decided to make his final stand. He was dying, and he knew it. His leg was a swollen, discolored mass of infection and shattered bone. The fever was a fire in his blood, and he was so weak from blood loss that the world was a permanent, shimmering mirage. He slid from his horse, collapsing to the ground. Silas dismounted and strode over to him, kicking him in the ribs. "Well?" Silas demanded, his face alight with greed. "Where is it? Where's the silver?" Haska looked up at him, a bloody, defiant smile on his lips. "There is no silver," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "I brought you here to die." The rage on Silas Kane's face was a terrible thing to behold. It was the impotent fury of a man who had been cheated not only of his prize, but of his superiority. Enraged by the betrayal, he decided Hask would not have an easy death. He would kill him slowly. After his men had rested, he ordered them to set up a camp for the night at the base of the sheer canyon wall. As the men unsaddled their horses and started a fire, their guard down, Haska used the last, final reserves of his strength. He had led them to this exact spot for a reason. Above them, on the canyon wall, was a section of loose, unstable rock, a rock slide waiting to happen. He had been a boy when he first saw it. With a final, superhuman effort, he raised his rifle, which they had left slung on his saddle, and fired. The bullet struck the keystone he had been aiming for. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, grinding groan, the entire rock face gave way. The ensuing chaos was immense. Rocks and boulders, some as large as a horse, rained down on the campsite with the force of cannonballs. Men screamed, horses shrieked and bolted, in the swirling dust and confusion. Hask, moving on pure will, lunged at Silas. This was not a heroic fight. It was the raw, desperate, final struggle of a dying man. They grappled at the very edge of a deep, shadowy precipice that bordered the campsite. Haski's only goal, the only purpose left in his life, was to take his tormentor with him into the dark. Ilara arrived at the canyon rim just as the rockslide began. She heard the thunderous roar and saw the cloud of dust rising from the canyon floor below. Her heart seized in her throat. She slid from her horse and scrambled down the treacherous rocky path, her own safety the last thing on her mind. She reached the canyon floor to a scene of utter carnage. Several of Kane's men lay crushed beneath the rocks. Others were injured, moaning in pain. And there, at the edge of the cliff, silhouetted against the dust-choked sky, she saw two figures locked in a deadly, swaying embrace. It was Hask and Silas. She raised the pistol she had taken from Cobb, her hands shaking, but they were grappling too fiercely, turning and twisting. She could not get a clear shot. She screamed his name, "Hask!" Her voice, or perhaps some final surge of will from within, seemed to reach him. He turned his head for a fraction of a second, and she thought, she prayed, that he saw her. In that moment, with a final, convulsive effort, Haska pushed himself backward, away from the cliff edge, driving his weight and Silas's with him, into the abyss. Ilara screamed his name again, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony that was swallowed by the vast, sudden emptiness of the canyon. She ran to the precipice, her feet stumbling on the loose rock, and looked down into the deep, unforgiving darkness. It was over. The man who had hunted her and the man who had saved her were both gone, consumed by the same earth. She collapsed onto the rocky ground, the heavy pistol falling from her nerveless hand. Her body was racked with sobs, great, heaving gasps that tore at her from the inside out. She was finally, irrevocably free. But she was utterly and completely alone. The love that had given her the strength to survive, the love for which she had been willing to die, had been sacrificed. In the echoing silence of the canyon, her victory was indistinguishable from the most profound and tragic loss she could ever imagine. The sun rose, spilling a wash of pale, indifferent light into the canyon of echoes. Ilara was kneeling on the cold stone of the precipice, a statue carved from shock and grief. The dust from the rockslide had begun to settle, revealing the full extent of the carnage below. The world had gone silent, the echoes of the screams and the thunder of the rocks fading into a ringing in her ears. Below, the surviving ranch hands began to stir, moving like dazed insects. Their leader was gone, their bravado shattered. They gathered their wounded, loaded their dead onto pack horses with grim, terrified faces, and fled the cursed place. They wanted no part of the questions, no part of the official inquiry that would surely follow the death of a man like Silas Kane. They cast fearful, sideways glances up at the lone figure of the woman on the rim, as if she were a ghost, a witch who had brought this ruin upon them. And then they were gone, their hoofbeats a frantic, fading rhythm, leaving Ilara utterly alone in the vast, silent tomb. Her grief was not a feeling. It was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. It was a vast, hollow emptiness inside her that mirrored the empty landscape stretching out in every direction. For a long time, she did not move. She simply knelt, the rising sun warming the cold stone beneath her knees, and stared into the abyss that had swallowed the man she loved. Finally, driven by some deep, primal instinct, she forced herself to her feet. Her movements were stiff, robotic, the movements of an automaton whose strings had been cut. Her first thought, her only thought, was to go down, to find his body, to perform some last, useless act of love. She scrambled to the edge, looking for a path, a foothold, anything. But the cliff was a sheer, unforgiving wall of red rock. The descent was impossible. This brutal physical barrier was a final, cruel metaphor for the finality of her loss. She could not reach him. He was gone, in a place she could not follow. The realization was a fresh wave of agony, and a single, dry sob tore from her throat. Driven by a numb, instinctual need to keep moving, to put one foot in front of the other, she turned away from the cliff and began the long journey back to the Hogan. The ride was a blur of sorrow. The land, which she had come to see through his eyes as a place of hidden life and harsh, profound beauty, now felt desolate and mocking. Every rock, every twisted juniper, every soaring hawk seemed to be a silent witness to her pain. The colors were too bright, the sky was too blue, the silence was too loud. It was his world, and he was no longer in it. When she arrived back at their hidden canyon, the place was exactly as they had left it that morning, a lifetime ago. His silversmithing tools were laid out neatly on his workbench, as if he had just stepped away for a moment. The coarse wool blanket on their shared sleeping pallet was still rumpled from their bodies. The ashes in the central fire pit were cold. Every object in the small, round home was a ghost, a painful, tangible reminder of the life they had briefly, impossibly shared. The silence in the Hogan was the loudest silence of all. Her eyes fell upon the small buckskin pouch where she kept her few treasures. She reached inside with trembling fingers and pulled out the small silver pendant he had made for her. She ran her thumb over its surface, feeling the cool, smooth metal, tracing the simple spiral that was meant to represent the journey of life, a journey that had been so brutally cut short. She closed her hand around it, clutching it tight, the edges digging into her palm. The metal was cool against her skin, the only tangible piece of him she had left in the world. She sat on the floor of the empty Hogan for a day and a night, the silver pendant her only companion. She did not eat or sleep. She simply sat, adrift in the wreckage of her life. As the second dawn broke, a new clarity began to emerge from the fog of her grief. She had a choice. She could disappear into the wilderness, live a solitary, silent life of mourning as Haske had done for so many years. The thought was a tempting one, a retreat from a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. Or she could return to that world. She could confront it. A new, cold purpose began to form in her heart. Haske had died to save her, but he had also died fighting an injustice. His sacrifice could not be in vain. His story, their story, could not simply vanish into the desert dust. The world that had judged him a savage needed to know that he had been a man of honor, an artist, a hero, fueled by this resolve, a need for his memory to be honored. She chose the latter. She would return. She rode Cobb's horse out of the canyon, leaving the hogan and its ghosts behind. She headed for redemption, the same dusty, windswept outpost where she had first stepped off the stagecoach into this new, brutal life. When she rode down the main street, her appearance created a stir. Heads turned. Men stopped in the street to stare. The whispers followed her like a cloud of flies. This was not the pale, frightened, elegantly dressed woman from Boston they remembered. This was someone else entirely. Her face was weathered and tanned by the sun, her hair was unbound, and she was clad in a simple, practical buckskin tunic. The butt of Cobb's pistol was visible, tucked into the gun belt at her hip. But the greatest change was in her eyes. They were not the eyes of a frightened girl. They were the eyes of a woman who had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. And they held a look of hard, cold, unyielding resolve. She dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, the word sheriff painted in faded letters on the board above the door. She tied the horse to the rail and, without a moment's hesitation, she walked inside. The sheriff, a weary, pragmatic man in his 50s named Bartlett, was sitting at his desk, staring at a pile of paperwork. He looked up as she entered, his eyes widening slightly in recognition, then narrowing in suspicion. "Mrs. Kane," he said, his voice flat. He had been one of the witnesses at her grim wedding. "My name is Alara Lowell," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I was never his wife." Bartlett leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. "You've been missing for some time. Miss Lowell, there's been talk, a substantial reward out for your return." He was skeptical. She could see it in his eyes. In this world, a woman's word, especially a woman who had disappeared under such scandalous circumstances, meant very little against the name of a powerful, wealthy man like Silas Kane. The prevailing prejudice, the story that would be easiest for everyone to believe, was that she had run off with a native man and was now trying to invent some story to cover her tracks. But Alara was no longer a woman who was easily intimidated. She stood before his desk, straight and tall, and she recounted the events of the past months. She spoke with a calm, chilling precision, her voice never wavering. She told him of the wedding night, of Silas's brutality, of her escape into the storm. She told him of Hask, of how he had found her and saved her life. She told him of the hunt, of the attack on the Hogan, and of the final, desperate confrontation in the Canyon of Echoes. Her testimony was powerful not because it was emotional, but because it was starkly, brutally factual. She did not weep or plead. She stated the facts, her voice a cold, level instrument of truth. Her complete transformation from the terrified bride he had briefly met into the confident, self-possessed survivor who stood before him was more compelling than any tears. "It's a fantastic story, Miss Lowell," Bartlett said when she had finished, though the skepticism in his voice had lessened, replaced by a grudging curiosity. "It is the truth," she replied, "and I have proof. The men who rode with Silas, the ones who survived the rock slide. Ask them. And there is a man named Cobb. I left him tied up in the Navajo's home. He was the guard Silas left behind." Sheriff Bartlett stared at her for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. He was an old, tired man who had seen too much of the West's casual brutality. He was intrigued, and perhaps, somewhere beneath his weary cynicism, he was moved by her conviction. He stood up, grabbing his hat from a peg on the wall. "All right, Miss Lowell," he said, "let's take a ride." He deputized 2 men and they rode first to Hask's Canyon. The place was silent, empty, inside the Hogan. They found Cobb, dehydrated and terrified, but alive. Under the sheriff's sharp questioning, the ranch hand's arrogance crumbled, and he corroborated enough of Alara's story, the attack, Silas's orders, his own role as guard, to give her tale the solid ring of truth. From there, they rode to the Canyon of Echoes. The scene was just as Alara had described it, the massive rock slide, the dead horses, the bodies of the men crushed beneath the boulders. It was a scene of violent, chaotic death. A long, painstaking search at the bottom of the precipice confirmed the rest. They found the bodies of Silas Kane and Haska, broken and entangled, a final grim testament to their deadly struggle. But the pivotal moment, the one that would turn the tide of justice, came when Bartlett was examining Hask's body. He saw two things. First, clutched tightly in Haska's cold, dead hand, was a torn piece of expensive, embroidered fabric from Silas Kane's waistcoat, a clear, undeniable sign of a desperate, hand-to-hand struggle. The second thing was more personal. As he looked at the native man's face, at his strong, calloused hands, he noticed the single silver bracelet Haska still wore. Bartlett recognized the style, the masterful workmanship. He had seen it before, on the counter of Jedediah's trading post. He had noted its quality then, had been surprised by its artistry. In that moment, looking at the evidence, at the man's creation, Sheriff Bartlett saw not a faceless, nameless savage, as the world would have him believe. He saw a man. He saw an artist. He saw a man who had fought to his last breath to protect the woman who now stood on the cliff edge above, her face a mask of stone. In a quiet, personal act of justice, Sheriff Bartlett's official report was a work of creative, but ultimately fair, storytelling. He wrote that Silas Kane and his men, in their relentless pursuit of wealth, had been prospecting for silver in the unstable canyons. They had been the victims of a tragic, accidental rock slide. It was a story that was clean, believable, and closed the book on the entire affair. It protected Ilara from the scandal and salacious gossip that would have followed her for the rest of her life. He omitted the details of her captivity, of Silas's brutality, and of Hask's heroic, sacrificial role. He effectively erased the improper parts of the story, the parts the world was not ready to hear, in order to give Ilara a clean slate. It was not perfect justice. The world would never know Haska's name or his courage. But in a world of such overwhelming, soul-crushing prejudice, it was a significant and profound victory. A week later, Ilara walked into the general store in Redemption. She unwrapped the small silver pendant from its buckskin pouch and placed it on the counter. The spiral of life, the last thing she had left of him. Selling it was an act of profound, agonizing sacrifice, like cutting off a piece of her own heart. But she was letting go of a relic of the past in order to build a future. The storekeeper, knowing its quality, gave her a fair price. She used the money to buy a small, abandoned plot of land with a run-down adobe cabin on it, not far from the mouth of the canyon system where he had lived. The townsfolk watched her, their minds filled with a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and a grudging, unspoken respect. They took to calling her the Kane Widow, a name that was both a brand and a shield. They did not understand her, so they left her alone. The story ends a year later. Ilara had made the cabin her home. The leaky roof was patched, the broken windows repaired. In the hard-packed dirt outside, a small, thriving garden grew, a splash of defiant green against the red earth. She had learned to live with her grief. It was no longer a gaping, open wound, but a part of her, like the scars on her hands, like the strength in her back. She was a solitary figure, but she was not a lonely one. Her strength and her resilience were her constant companions. In the final scene, she is standing on a small bluff behind her cabin, watching the sun set over the vast desert landscape. The sky is a riot of color, orange and pink and purple, the same colors that had filled the sky on the day of their first kiss. The light catches on the intricate silver bracelet on her wrist. It was the one piece of his she had kept, the one she could not bear to part with, the one with the pattern like falling rain. She is not defined by her tragedy, but forged by it. Hask's love did not just save her life, it had given her a new one, a life of freedom, strength, and quiet self-reliance that he, in his own solitary existence, could never have. His memory did not live in a grave or in a story told by others. It lived on in her strength, in her survival, in her quiet, unyielding presence in the heart of the wild, beautiful land he had taught her to love. The glimmer of hope was not in a happy ending, but in her enduring, resilient spirit. Thank you for gathering around the campfire with us to hear this tale, and please feel free to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers on this journey. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.